there exists a threshold, ancient and intangible, where the visible world surrenders to the invisible. It is a boundary as fragile as a spider's thread, yet more formidable than any fortress of stone and iron. On one side lies the realm we inhabit, material, comprehensible, bound by the laws of nature and reason. On the other side dwells something far older, far stranger, a cosmos populated by beings whose very existence defies our understanding of beauty, power, and purpose. Today, we stand at that threshold together, and we invite you to cross it with us. We are about to enter the realm of the Peri, and their story is one that has captivated minds for thousands of years across Persia, Arabia, and beyond. Imagine one, if you will, a creature born not of flesh and blood, but of pure radiance and ethereal substance. The Peri exists at the intersection of light and shadow, dwelling in the liminal spaces between heaven and earth. In ancient texts and sacred scrolls, they are described as Djinn, of extraordinary beauty, so magnificent that human sight strains to comprehend their splendor. Their forms shimmer with an otherworldly luminescence, adorned with wings, reminiscent of butterflies or celestial birds, and they carry with them the fragrance of gardens that exist only in paradise. Yet, there is profound tragedy woven into their very essence. These beings are exiles. They are the banished, cast out from the gardens of eternity for transgressions both grave and terrifyingly minor. This is their curse, and this is their story. The Peri have not always been understood as they are today. Their mythology is layered, complex, and deeply intertwined with the spiritual evolution of the Persian and Arab peoples. In the ancient Zoroastrian faith, long before Islam reshaped the cultural landscape, the Peri were perceived as demons, malevolent spirits of chaos and corruption. They were forces to be feared, opposed, and contained through ritual and sacred knowledge. But as centuries passed and new faiths rose to prominence, the narrative of the Peri transformed. With the advent of Islamic theology, these beings underwent a profound metamorphosis in the collective imagination. They transitioned from purely evil entities into something far more nuanced, souls capable of redemption, seeking always to return to divine grace. This transformation reflects not a contradiction, but rather a deepening understanding of the universe itself. A recognition that even the most foreign and frightening forces possess complexity, motivation, and the possibility of salvation. Throughout the Persian literary canon, particularly in the monumental epic known as the Shahnameh, or Book of Kings, the Peri emerged as protectors of humanity. They stand as guardians against the malevolent Djinn that plague mortals, using their celestial power to defend the righteous and preserve the balance between worlds. In these stories, the Peri are not merely creatures of supernatural power, they are moral agents, choosing to align themselves with justice despite their own suffering and exile. They understand the laws of both realms and navigate them with wisdom earned through eons of existence. What makes the Peri so enduringly fascinating is their profound duality. They are beings of incomparable beauty, yet marked by sorrow. They possess divine knowledge and celestial power, yet they long desperately for the grace they have lost. They are capable of compassion and protection, yet capable also of transgression and forbidden longing. This complexity refuses simple categorization, and therein lies their power as mythological figures. The Peri cannot be dismissed as mere fantasy or ancient superstition. They represent something essential about the human condition, our capacity for longing, our vulnerability to fate, and our endless struggle between duty and desire. Before we venture deeper into these mysteries, we want to invite you into this journey fully. If you are finding yourself drawn to these ancient tales and the worlds they illuminate, we encourage you to subscribe to Echoes of the Old World, where we continue to explore the myths, legends, and spiritual traditions that have shaped human consciousness across centuries and cultures. Your presence here means everything to the continuation of these stories. We also invite you to share your own connection to these narratives. Perhaps you have heard whispers of the Peri in your own cultural heritage. Or maybe this is your first encounter with these mysterious beings. We would genuinely love to hear from you in the comments below. Where are you watching from, and what drew you to the story of the Peri today? The Peri are not merely inhabitants of ancient texts and forgotten folklore. They remain alive in the cultural memory of millions, their imagery resonating through art, literature, music, and spiritual practice even in our modern age. In the miniature paintings of Persian courts, the Peri appear adorned in robes of silk and starlight, surrounded by flowers that bloom only in the gardens beyond mortality. In the mystical poetry of Sufi saints, the Peri becomes a metaphor for the soul-seeking reunification with the divine. In the stories told by grandmothers to children on moonlit nights, the Peri embodies both warning and hope, a reminder that the world is far stranger and more wondrous than we might imagine. As we embark upon this exploration together, we will examine the Peri from every angle: their origins in pre-Islamic Zoroastrianism, their transformation through Islamic theological interpretation, their pivotal role in Persian epic literature, their breathtaking visual representation, and their most profoundly tragic narratives. The tales of Peri, who fell in love with mortal humans, who defied divine law for passion, who sacrificed everything for moments of earthly connection. We will explore the difference between the Peri and the Houris of Islamic paradise, distinguishing between these celestial beings with precision and reverence. Most importantly, we will seek to understand what the Peri represent. Not merely creatures of myth, but mirrors reflecting humanity's deepest yearnings, our capacity for both transgression and redemption, and our eternal fascination with the threshold between the known and the unknowable, To understand the Peri as they emerged in Islamic theology and Persian literature, we must first venture backward through time, beyond the reach of modern memory, into an era when a different cosmology governed the Persian imagination. We journey now to the world of ancient Zoroastrianism, a faith that dominated the Persian landscape for over 1,000 years before the Islamic conquest reshaped the spiritual foundations of the region. In this pre-Islamic worldview, the universe was conceived as a battleground between two fundamental forces: Ahura Mazda, the wise lord of light and goodness, and Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit of darkness and chaos. Every phenomenon in nature, every moral choice, every supernatural being was understood through this cosmic duality. The Peri, in this ancient framework, belonged unambiguously to the forces of corruption and malevolence. In Zoroastrian cosmology, the Peri were known as demons, Daiva in the ancient Persian language, entities fundamentally opposed to the divine order. They were not fallen angels or exiled immortals seeking redemption. They were obstacles to be overcome, enemies to be defeated through ritual purity and spiritual vigilance. The very word Daiva carried connotations of deception and harm, and the Peri embodied these qualities entirely. They were creatures of trickery and seduction, using their ethereal beauty not as a blessing, but as a weapon to ensnare the unwary and draw them towards spiritual corruption. In the sacred texts of Zoroastrianism, particularly in the Avesta, these beings are portrayed as active agents of Angra Mainyu, working tirelessly to undermine the righteous order established by Ahura Mazda. Their supernatural power made them formidable adversaries, capable of inflicting genuine harm upon both the physical and spiritual planes of existence. The Zoroastrian Peri were understood to inhabit the liminal spaces between worlds, the mountains, the deserts, the twilight hours when the boundary between day and night grows thin and permeable. Picture yourself standing upon a vast plateau in ancient Persia, where the wind carries whispers across barren stone and sparse vegetation. In such places, the Peri were believed to dwell, watching and waiting for opportunities to lead mortals astray. They were particularly attracted to acts of ritual impurity, to places where sacred fire had been defiled, to individuals whose spiritual defenses had weakened through moral transgression. The Peri served as cosmic punishers, in a sense, exploiting human weakness and amplifying the destructive impulses already present in the human heart. They represented not external evil alone, but the internalized capacity for corruption that exists within every soul, that dangerous potential for a person to stray from the righteous path. The physical characteristics attributed to the Peri in Zoroastrian tradition differed markedly from their later, more romanticized portrayals. While later Islamic and Persian sources would describe them as beings of incomparable beauty, the Zoroastrian texts often emphasized their grotesque and disturbing aspects. They were depicted as shapeshifters, capable of assuming multiple forms, sometimes appearing as beautiful seductresses, other times as hideous monsters, and frequently as creatures of confusing and contradictory appearance. This instability of form reflected their fundamental nature as agents of chaos and deception. The Peri could not be trusted, even in their most appealing manifestations, for beauty itself became a tool of manipulation and harm. Their association with certain animals, particularly nocturnal creatures, emphasized their connection to darkness and hidden danger. In artistic representations and textual descriptions, the Zoroastrian Peri carried an aura of transgression and wrongness that made them instantly recognizable as beings fundamentally opposed to cosmic order. The cultural context that produced this demonization of the Peri was profoundly practical as well as theological. Zoroastrianism emerged and flourished in a land of extremes, vast deserts, towering mountains, and unpredictable weather patterns that could bring sudden death or prosperity. In such an environment, the visible world was perpetually contested between forces of cultivation and destruction, order and chaos. The Peri, as demonic forces, explained natural disasters and inexplicable misfortunes that plagued communities. A plague that devastated livestock could be attributed to Peri influence. A sudden madness that seized an individual could be traced to demonic possession. The seasonal cycles themselves, with their violent transitions between abundance and scarcity, could be understood as the ongoing struggle between Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu, with the Peri serving as active combatants on the side of destruction. Moreover, the Zoroastrian framework provided a comprehensive system of protection and resistance against the Peri. Ritual purity became paramount. Specific practices involving sacred fire, the ritual purification with water and ash, and the constant vigilance of moral behavior were understood as spiritual armor against demonic interference. The Peri could not approach those who maintained perfect ritual purity and unwavering moral rectitude. This belief system served a crucial social function, reinforcing communal standards of behavior and creating a shared sense of spiritual security. Every act of righteousness was conceived not merely as personal morality, but as active participation in the cosmic battle against chaos and the Peri who embodied it. It is essential to recognize that this Zoroastrian understanding of the Peri was not abandoned when Islam arrived. Rather, it was transformed, reinterpreted, and ultimately transcended. The Islamic conquest of Persia in the 7th century did not erase the cultural memory of these beings or the centuries of theological reflection that had accumulated around them. Instead, the Peri underwent one of the most profound metamorphoses in religious history, a transformation that would completely alter their status, their moral significance, and their role in the spiritual imagination. What had been purely and absolutely evil would become something far more complex. Beings capable of sin, yes, but also capable of redemption. Fallen, certainly, but not irredeemably so. Exiled, but not without hope of return to divine favor. This transition represents a fundamental shift in how the ancient Persian world reconciled with the new faith, preserving and reinterpreting its ancestral mythology within an entirely new theological framework. The conquest of Persia by Islamic forces in the 7th century represents one of the most profound spiritual crossroads in human history. When the armies of the Caliphate swept across the Persian plateau, they did not arrive merely as military conquerors. They arrived as bearers of a new theological framework that would fundamentally reshape how the ancient peoples understood themselves, their relationship to the divine, and the nature of the supernatural beings that inhabited their myths. Yet something remarkable occurred in this moment of cultural collision. Rather than entirely displacing the existing mythology, Islam engaged with it, reinterpreted it, and ultimately elevated it to new heights of spiritual complexity. The Peri, those demonic beings of Zoroastrian cosmology, underwent a transformation so profound that they emerged as figures worthy not of fear alone, but of compassion and even reverence. This metamorphosis did not happen overnight. It was gradual, theological, and deeply rooted in the Islamic understanding of mercy, redemption, and divine justice. The Quran itself makes reference to Djinn in Arabic, and establishes them as beings created from smokeless fire, possessing intellect and free will, capable of both righteousness and transgression. This Islamic categorization of Djinn was revolutionary. Unlike the purely demonic diver of Zoroastrian tradition, these beings were not inherently evil. They were simply other creatures inhabiting realms adjacent to human existence, subject like humans to moral judgment and capable of choosing between obedience and rebellion. The Peri, understood through this new Islamic lens, became Djinn, and Djinn could be righteous or wicked. More significantly, they could repent. They could seek forgiveness. They could yearn for divine grace and work toward redemption. This theological shift opened an entirely new narrative space for the Peri within Islamic thought. They transformed from absolute enemies of the cosmic order into complex spiritual beings whose redemptive journeys mirrored the spiritual struggles of humans themselves. Consider the profound theological implication of this transformation. In Zoroastrianism, the Peri were locked in eternal opposition to divine order. Their corruption was fundamental and unchangeable. In Islam, even the most fallen creature retained the possibility of return to grace. This reflects a deeply humanistic aspect of Islamic theology, the belief that divine mercy transcends all boundaries, that repentance is always possible, and that the universe itself bends toward justice and redemption. The Peri, in this new framework, became symbols of this redemptive possibility. They were exiled from paradise, not because they were inherently evil, but because they had transgressed minor laws or succumbed to momentary weakness. Their exile became tragic rather than merely punitive. It became a separation from divine presence that could potentially be healed through genuine repentance and righteous action. The development of this new understanding was facilitated by what scholars term religious syncretism, the blending of beliefs and practices from different traditions. The Islamic scholars and theologians who encountered the deeply rooted mythology of the Peri did not reject it outright. Instead, they engaged with it thoughtfully, asking how these ancient beings could be understood within Islamic cosmology. This process of reconciliation produced a mythology that was neither purely Zoroastrian nor purely Islamic, but rather a hybrid vision that preserved the cultural heritage of Persia while incorporating it into an Islamic spiritual framework. The Peri retained their ethereal beauty, their supernatural power, and their tragic exile, but these qualities acquired new meaning within Islamic theology. The concept of the Peri seeking redemption became central to this transformed mythology. In Islamic tradition, even Djinn could receive revelation. They could understand divine law and choose to obey it. The Peri, understood as a specific category of Djinn, began to appear in theological and literary works as beings engaged in spiritual struggle, yearning to return to divine favor, performing righteous deeds, and hoping that their current separation from paradise might eventually give way to reunion with the divine source they had known. This narrative of redemptive longing gave the Peri a poignancy that pure demonology could never achieve. They became figures of profound tragedy and spiritual dignity, worthy of meditation and even sympathy. The exiled nature of the Peri acquired new significance in Islamic understanding. Rather than simply banishment for cosmic disorder, their exile could be understood as a test, a spiritual trial, through which they might prove their worthiness for eventual restoration. Islamic theology emphasizes that trials and difficulties serve purposes in the divine plan. They refine the soul and demonstrate commitment to righteousness. The Peri's exile from paradise became interpretable through this lens. Their separation from divine presence was painful, yes, but it was also potentially redemptive. Each act of righteousness they performed, each human they protected, each resistance against their own darker impulses could be understood as steps along the path toward eventual return to grace. This framework transformed the narrative of the Peri from one of cosmic opposition into one of spiritual pilgrimage. The theological nuance introduced by Islamic interpretation also opened space for exploring the Peri's transgression with greater complexity. What minor offense could result in separation from paradise? The answer varied across different tellings and scholarly interpretations, but the question itself was significant. It acknowledged that the Peri's fall was not the result of choosing absolute evil, but rather of a moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment, a transgression that, while serious enough to warrant exile, did not obliterate the possibility of redemption. This psychological complexity enriched the mythology considerably. The Peri emerged not as fearless demons, but as beings capable of doubt, remorse, and the deep desire to restore themselves to divine favor. The syncretism that produced this transformed understanding of the Peri also allowed for the coexistence of multiple theological perspectives. Within Islamic tradition, different schools of thought in different regions produced varying interpretations of these beings. Some maintained more of the Zoroastrian emphasis on their danger and otherworldliness. Others developed more sympathetic understandings that emphasized their redemptive potential. This plurality of interpretation became itself part of the mythology. The Peri were complex beings that different communities might understand in somewhat different ways. Yet, all agreed upon their fundamental nature as exiled creatures, yearning for return to divine presence. This flexibility allowed the mythology to adapt to new contexts while maintaining its essential character. As Islamic civilization flourished across Persia over the following centuries, the reinterpreted mythology of the Peri became woven into the fabric of Persian Islamic culture. It appeared in theological discussions, in mystical poetry, in popular stories, and eventually in the grand epics that would define Persian literature. The Peri transformed from demons to be feared into figures worthy of contemplation. beings whose exile mirrored the human condition, whose yearning for grace reflected universal spiritual longings, and whose potential for redemption offered hope that even the most fallen could find their way back to divine light. This transformation represents one of history's most elegant examples of how religious traditions can encounter one another not as absolute opponents, but as partners in an ongoing conversation about the nature of divinity, morality, and redemption. The transformation of the Peri from demonic beings to redeemable souls found its fullest expression not in theological discourse, but in the grand narrative architecture of Persian literature. We journey now to the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, an epic poem of staggering scope composed by Ferdowsi in the 10th century. This monumental work, spanning over 50,000 verses, represents the culmination of centuries of Persian mythological tradition and the decisive moment when the Peri stepped fully into their redemptive role as protectors of humanity. In the Shahnameh, the Peri are no longer peripheral figures or abstract theological concepts. They become active agents in the cosmic drama, wielding their power not against mortals but alongside them, defending the righteous against the malevolent forces that threaten both the physical and spiritual realms. Their appearance in these narratives marks a spiritual maturation of Persian mythology, a recognition that even beings born of transgression and exile could achieve dignity through righteous action. The Shahnameh presents a cosmos where multiple forms of supernatural beings inhabit layers of reality adjacent to the human world. Among these beings, the Djinn represent a fundamental threat, creatures of destructive power and malevolent intelligence capable of inflicting devastation upon kingdoms and dynasties. Yet, not all Djinn are malevolent. Some possess wisdom and can be bargained with or allied to human causes. The Peri occupy a unique position in this supernatural hierarchy. They are Djinn, yes, but Djinn transformed by their desire for redemption. They are beings who have chosen to align themselves with the forces of good, who understand both human nature and the laws of the supernatural world, and who actively work to prevent malevolent Djinn from bringing ruin upon mortals. This distinction is critical. The Peri are not merely neutral observers of human affairs, nor are they benevolent deities bestowing blessings from a distance. They are engaged participants in ongoing spiritual warfare, combating chaos and corruption at every turn. The specific narratives involving the Peri in the Shahnameh reveal them as warriors and strategists, not merely as ethereal beauties. When human heroes face threats from supernatural forces, the Peri frequently appear as allies and guides. They possess knowledge of the supernatural realms and the rules that govern interaction between worlds. They know which mystical words hold power, which substances can harm or bind malevolent Djinn, and how to navigate the treacherous terrain where mortal and immortal realities intersect. In these moments, the Peri function as mentors, figures who impart wisdom that proves essential for human survival and triumph. Their role as protectors reflects an underlying moral philosophy. Those who have suffered exile and remain committed to redemption possess special insight into the nature of transgression and the possibility of restoration. The Peri, having experienced separation from divine favor, understand intimately the stakes of moral choice and the consequences of destructive behavior. Consider the profound symbolic weight of having exiled beings serve as defenders of the mortal realm. This reversal of the Zoroastrian framework carries deep spiritual meaning. In the old cosmology, the Peri represented threats that humanity must defend itself against through ritual purity and moral vigilance. In the Shahnameh, the Peri become humanity's allies precisely because of their own fallen state. They know the dangers of transgression and have chosen the path of redemption. This transformation suggests a theology where suffering and exile can produce not bitterness and malevolence, but compassion and commitment to justice. The Peri who protect humans are demonstrating their worthiness for eventual return to divine favor through active service to the righteous. Every intervention on behalf of mortals, every sacrifice made in defense against malevolent forces, every moment of steadfast commitment to righteousness serves as a step along their redemptive journey. The Shahnameh also portrays the Peri as beings who understand the complexity of human moral struggle. They do not judge mortals harshly for their weakness or their occasional lapses into error. Instead, they offer guidance and protection, demonstrating a compassion that reflects their own painful understanding of exile and longing. This portrayal enriches the characterization of the Peri considerably. They are not distant cosmic forces imposing arbitrary rules from on high. They are beings who have walked difficult paths themselves and who recognize the genuine difficulty of maintaining righteousness in a world where temptation and danger constantly press upon mortals. Their protectiveness contains an element of identification. They defend humans partly because they recognize in human struggle their own spiritual journey. The specific circumstances under which Peri intervene in the Shahnameh are particularly revealing. They typically appear not to prevent all suffering or hardship, for such would be to undermine the moral dimensions of human choice, but rather to prevent catastrophic spiritual or physical ruin, particularly when righteous individuals face threats from purely malevolent sources. The Peri allow mortals to face trials and adversities that build character and spiritual strength, but they intervene when the threat approaches annihilation or when a righteous cause faces destruction at the hands of purely corrupt forces. This nuanced understanding of protection and intervention suggests a sophisticated moral philosophy where the Peri recognize that some struggles are necessary for human growth, while others represent genuine threats to the continuance of justice and righteousness in the world. The Peri also serve in the Shahnameh as preservers and transmitters of sacred knowledge. In various narratives, they function as keepers of secrets and wisdom that must be protected from those who would use such knowledge for destructive purposes. They guard the boundaries between the mortal and immortal realms, ensuring that these boundaries are not violated in ways that would cause catastrophic disruption. This function reflects the ancient Persian understanding that the proper ordering of cosmic boundaries is essential to existence itself. The Peri, by maintaining these boundaries and preventing unauthorized crossings, are preserving not merely human safety, but the structural integrity of creation itself. Their work as guardians is thus simultaneously mundane and cosmic. They protect individual humans from immediate threats, but they also maintain the larger systems that prevent universal chaos. The characterization of the Peri in the Shahnameh establishes them as moral agents of considerable complexity and wisdom. They are neither simple servants of humans nor distant supernatural powers indifferent to mortal suffering. They are beings pursuing their own redemptive journey while simultaneously recognizing their responsibility to contribute to the welfare of the righteous. This portrayal suggests that exile and suffering, properly understood and properly responded to, can produce not corruption, but deepening moral insight and commitment to justice. The Peri become exemplars of how transgression can be transcended, how exile can be endured with dignity, and how former demons can become protectors, not through simple moral transformation, but through sustained commitment to righteous action over centuries of effort. Throughout the literary traditions and artistic representations that have preserved the memory of the Peri across centuries, one element stands constant and unmistakable: their extraordinary beauty. Yet this beauty cannot be dismissed as merely aesthetic, a simple matter of pleasing proportions and refined features. The beauty of the Peri operates on an entirely different register than human loveliness. It transcends the categories we normally use to evaluate attractiveness and enters instead into the realm of the overwhelming, the disorienting, the almost unbearable to witness. When ancient texts describe the Peri, they reach repeatedly for language that strains the boundaries of human expression, struggling to convey something that fundamentally exceeds human visual experience. We are told that their beauty surpasses that of any mortal, that it approaches the beauty of the divine itself, that those who gaze upon them experience a kind of vertigo as their minds struggle to process forms and features that seem to violate the normal rules of aesthetic possibility. Imagine standing before a being whose physical form seems to shimmer and shift subtly even as you observe it. The Peri do not simply exist in space as solid objects do. They seem to vibrate with an inner luminescence, as though their bodies contain light rather than merely reflect it. This radiance is often described as having a silvery or golden quality, reminiscent of starlight or the gentle glow of precious metals. The skin of the Peri is frequently portrayed as almost translucent, as though one could see through the outer surface to something deeper and more essential beneath. There is a quality of otherworldliness that no amount of conventional beauty could achieve. The Peri are beautiful, not merely in their features, but in their fundamental nature, as beings composed of substance alien to earthly matter. In Persian miniatures and literary descriptions, artists and poets attempt to capture this luminous quality through elaborate metaphors. The Peri's skin is like pearls, like moonlight, like the surface of still water reflecting stars. The most distinctive physical characteristic of the Peri across virtually all traditions is their wings. These are never described as the functional appendages of birds or insects, though the Peri's wings often resemble those creatures in appearance. Instead, the wings of the Peri seem to serve purposes simultaneously practical and symbolic. Some accounts describe butterfly wings of impossible delicacy and intricacy, each scale shimmering with colors that seem to shift and change as light moves across them. Other traditions portray the Peri as possessing wings more akin to those of great birds, perhaps eagles or peacocks, with feathers that flow with movement and seem composed of spun glass or crystalline substance. The wings are invariably described as beautiful in themselves, worthy of contemplation as aesthetic objects independent of their function. Yet their primary significance lies not in their appearance, but in what they represent. The Peri's essential nature as creatures of the threshold, beings capable of traversing the boundaries between earth and heaven, material and spiritual realms, the visible and invisible worlds. Beyond the radiant skin are magnificent wings. The facial features of the Peri are rendered in literature with obsessive detail. Their eyes are described as possessing a depth and clarity that human eyes simply cannot match. These eyes are often said to contain knowledge, not the surface knowledge of facts and events, but deeper understanding of cosmic truths and spiritual mysteries. The gaze of a Peri is described as capable of penetrating surfaces to perceive the essential nature of things. Their eyes are frequently given colors that do not naturally occur in human populations: violet, amber, silver, or colors that seem to contain within themselves hints of other hues that shift and change depending on the angle of observation and the quality of light. The facial structure of the Peri is characterized by a kind of perfect symmetry that seems to transcend individual variations, yet paradoxically by a distinctiveness that makes each Peri instantly recognizable as a unique individual. There is something almost mathematical about their beauty, proportions so precise and harmonious that they achieve a perfection that nature, in its evolutionary processes, has never attempted in the fashioning of human forms. The hair of the Peri receives attention in artistic and literary representations, rivaling that given to more obviously beautiful features. Their hair is frequently described as flowing like water, as possessing an almost fluid quality that allows it to move with grace and fluidity exceeding normal physics. The color of Peri hair is often rendered as black as the deepest night or as radiant silver, though other descriptions portray tones of deep blue or violet. In Persian miniature paintings, the hair of Peri is rendered with meticulous detail, often shown adorned with flowers, pearls, or jeweled ornaments. The flowers that appear in Peri hair are not mere decoration, but carry symbolic significance. Roses representing love and passion, jasmine indicating fragrance and purity, lotus flowers symbolizing spiritual aspiration. These floral adornments are never portrayed as artificial additions, but rather as emerging naturally from the Peri's form, suggesting an intimate connection between the Peri and the plant world. Indeed, the association between the Peri and flowers represents one of the most profound symbolic dimensions of their physical representation. The Peri are constantly surrounded by flowers in artistic depictions. Gardens of impossible beauty bloom wherever they walk. Flowers open in response to their presence, and their garments and ornaments incorporate floral motifs extensively. This connection operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Practically, flowers are precious and rare in the desert environments where much of Persian and Arabian mythology originates, making flowers valuable symbols of rarity, beauty, and the precious. Spiritually, flowers represent the cycle of blooming and transformation, the opening toward light and divine essence. The Peri's association with flowers suggests their connection to natural cycles and regenerative forces, to beauty that continually renews itself through creation and rebirth. The fragrance of the Peri is perhaps equally important as their visual appearance, occupying a crucial role in how these beings are conceptualized. The Peri are insistently associated with perfume and fragrance, particularly with the scents of flowers, exotic spices, and substances whose origins seem to lie beyond the mortal world. When the Peri move through space, they leave trails of fragrance that linger long after their physical departure. This olfactory dimension of Peri presence carries profound significance. Fragrance is ephemeral, intangible, yet powerfully affecting to consciousness. The ability to smell the Peri's fragrance suggests an encounter with something both present and elusive, real, yet not entirely material. In Islamic and Persian mystical traditions, fragrance frequently symbolizes the divine presence, the idea that God's nearness can be sensed even when God remains invisible and transcendent. The Peri's fragrance thus becomes a marker of their liminal nature, their existence at the boundary between material and spiritual realms. The garments worn by the Peri in artistic representations are rendered with extraordinary attention to detail and symbolic significance. They are frequently portrayed wearing robes of silk and precious fabrics, often in colors of deep blue, violet, or emerald green. These garments flow with movements that seem to respond to forces beyond normal gravity, giving the impression that the Peri are surrounded by invisible currents of wind or magical energy. The fabrics are often shown embroidered with elaborate patterns, geometric designs, floral motifs, or celestial imagery incorporating stars and moon crescents. Jewelry adorns the Peri extensively: bracelets, anklets, necklaces, and tiaras composed of precious metals and jewels. Yet these ornaments are never portrayed as mere decoration added to the Peri's form. They seem almost to grow organically from their bodies, to be an integral part of their essential being rather than external additions. This integration of adornment with the Peri's very form emphasizes their nature as beings. for whom beauty is not something achieved through effort, but rather something fundamental to their essential existence. Throughout the Islamic world, both in theology and in popular imagination, there exists a potential source of confusion regarding two categories of supernatural female beings: the Peri and the Houri. Both are creatures of extraordinary beauty, both inhabit realms adjacent to human existence, and both appear prominently in Islamic cosmology and literary tradition. Yet these are fundamentally different beings, occupying entirely distinct roles within the spiritual architecture of Islamic thought. To confuse them is to misunderstand crucial aspects of Islamic eschatology, the nature of divine reward, and the relationship between the mortal and immortal realms. The distinction between Peri and Houris illuminates not merely matters of theological classification, but profound truths about the nature of divinity, justice, and spiritual aspiration. By examining these differences carefully, we come to understand what makes the Peri uniquely significant as figures of redemptive struggle rather than simple rewards offered by the divine. The Houri, or her in the singular, represents one of the rewards promised to the righteous in Islamic paradise. They are beings created specifically for existence in Jannah, the Islamic heaven, and they are depicted in the Quran and in Hadith literature as beings of incomparable beauty, available to serve and accompany the blessed in paradise. The Houris are not created from earthly matter. They are beings of pure spiritual substance, fashioned directly by divine will to exist eternally in states of beauty and perfection. Crucially, the Houris are not beings with their own independent agency, desires, or spiritual journeys. They exist essentially as manifestations of divine generosity, as symbols of the abundance and pleasure that characterize paradise. Their role is entirely relational. They exist in relation to the righteous who have earned entry to paradise, serving as companions and embodiments of divine reward. To put it plainly, the Houris are created beings whose purpose is to inhabit paradise, not creatures engaged in their own spiritual struggles or seeking redemption. The Peri, by contrast, are entities engaged in their own cosmic drama. They possess independent agency, their own desires, their own spiritual aspirations. The Peri are not created specifically for paradise. They have been cast out from it. They are not servants of divine reward. They are seekers of divine mercy. The Peri's existence centers not on their relationship to human bliss, but rather on their own effort to restore themselves to the grace they have lost. This distinction is profound and essential. Where the Houri represents static perfection, a state already achieved and maintained eternally, the Peri represents dynamic spiritual struggle, the ongoing effort to transcend exile and restore oneself to divine favor. The Houri dwells perpetually in fulfillment. The Peri dwells perpetually in longing. These are not merely different beings. They represent entirely different categories of supernatural existence and different relationships to the divine. The origin stories of these beings further illuminate their fundamental differences. The Houris are understood to have been created at the moment of creation itself, brought into existence by divine fiat for the specific purpose they serve. Their creation is an act of generosity and provision on God's part, establishing rewards for those who will prove themselves worthy through righteous action in the mortal world. The Houris have never known exile or separation from divine presence. They exist in a state of perpetual proximity to the divine, as creatures specifically designed for service within paradise itself. The Peri, conversely, possess a history of transgression and exile. They knew paradise at one time. They inhabited realms of divine presence before their fall. Their exile carries memory and longing, the knowledge of what they have lost. The Houris' perfection is untested and eternal. The Peri's redemptive aspirations are earned through endurance and righteousness over vast spans of time. The theological implications of these differences extend far beyond matters of mere categorization. In Islamic thought, the existence of the Houris emphasizes divine mercy and generosity, God's willingness to provide abundant rewards for those who serve righteously. The Houris serve as proof of divine benevolence and the reality of paradise. They are not beings who struggle or suffer. They are beings who embody the fulfillment of human longing. The Peri, by contrast, embody different spiritual truths. They represent the possibility of redemption, the idea that even serious transgression need not be eternal, that effort and righteous action can gradually restore what has been lost. The Peri speak to the human experience of failure and the possibility of restoration far more directly than the Houri. Where the Houri represents the promise of reward for success, the Peri represents the possibility of recovery from failure. The relationship between these beings and mortals differs significantly. The Houris exist in a realm separated by the boundaries of death and paradise. Humans cannot encounter Houris in the earthly realm, though they may hope to be reunited with Houris in the afterlife. The Peri, however, can and do interact with mortals in the earthly realm. They can love humans, protect them, guide them, and be guided by them. This capacity for genuine interaction and relationship distinguishes the Peri profoundly from the Houris. The Peri are not fixed in predetermined roles. They navigate between worlds, engage with change and possibility, adapt their actions to circumstances. The Houris, though beautiful and perfect, exist more as fixed manifestations of divine generosity than as dynamic agents of their own will. Certainly, Islamic theologians and poets have sometimes employed ambiguous language regarding these beings, and different regional traditions and different scholarly authorities have emphasized different aspects of the distinction. Yet the core understanding remains consistent. The Houri belongs to paradise, created for eternity within Jannah. The Peri belongs to the threshold between worlds, engaged in spiritual journey and seeking return to divine favor. Some mystical traditions, particularly in Persian Sufism, have suggested that the pursuit of the Peri, understanding their story and sympathizing with their exile, becomes itself a spiritual practice. The contemplation of the Peri's redemptive struggle can inspire similar efforts in mortals, while the contemplation of the Houri encourages hope for ultimate reward. Perhaps most significantly, the Peri story allows for exploration of themes that the Houri story cannot accommodate. The Peri narrative encompasses transgression without eternal condemnation, exile without irredeemable corruption, suffering as transformative rather than punitive. The Peri's journey offers spiritual complexity and moral texture that the Houri's fixed perfection cannot provide. In literature and in theological meditation, the Peri becomes a figure of identification, a being whose struggles reflect human struggles, whose exile mirrors the human experience of separation from divine presence, whose redemptive journey mirrors human spiritual aspiration. The Houri remains always somewhat distant, always perfect and foreign to human experience of imperfection and struggle. Thus, while both beings occupy important places within Islamic spirituality, they serve entirely different functions and embody entirely different spiritual principles. And understanding this distinction proves essential to understanding the unique significance of the Peri within Islamic and Persian tradition. There exists within the mythology of the Peri a narrative thread darker and more profoundly tragic than any other element of their story. It is the thread of forbidden love, the overwhelming passion that draws these celestial beings across the boundaries separating immortal and mortal existence. leading them into transgression that echoes across centuries. The love of a Peri for a human is not the simple romantic attachment we know in mortal experience. It is something far more desperate, far more consuming, and far more dangerous. It represents the collision of two fundamentally incompatible modes of existence: the infinite against the finite, the eternal against the temporal, the divine against the earthly. When a Peri loves a human, she loves not merely an individual, but an entire world that can never truly be hers. She loves impossibly, against cosmic law, against the very structure of reality itself. This love becomes both the most beautiful and most destructive force in the Peri's spiritual journey, often marking the moment when redemption slips further away, even as the Peri's heart seems most filled with righteous emotion. The origins of such love are often described in terms that emphasize its involuntary nature. The Peri does not choose to love a human. She is overcome by this passion, as though struck by an arrow from an invisible archer. Perhaps she glimpses a mortal from a liminal space, twilight, dawn, the surface of still water. And in that moment, something awakens within her that cannot be extinguished. Perhaps she sees in a human face a reflection of something she knew in paradise, some beauty or innocence that stirs her deepest memories of grace. Perhaps it is simply that mortality itself attracts the Peri, the tragic finitude of human existence, the terrible knowledge that these beautiful creatures will fade and die, calls forth a protective tenderness that transforms into something deeper. The moment a Peri's love for a human awakens, her exile deepens. She has already been separated from paradise. Now she separates herself further by desiring what is forbidden, not merely a transgression of cosmic law, but a voluntary stepping away from the redemptive path she has been following. The consequences of such love are immediate and catastrophic. The Peri who loves a human often finds herself unable to continue the righteous deeds that characterize the pursuit of redemption. Her attention is divided, her heart is elsewhere. Her actions become motivated by desire for the beloved rather than by commitment to justice and righteousness. She may seek to protect this particular human above all others, to shower him with supernatural gifts and interventions that other mortals do not receive. She may attempt to elevate him, to bring him closer to the supernatural realm, to draw him into her world of eternal beauty and cosmic significance. In doing so, she risks both herself and the human she loves. The divine law that separated the mortal and immortal realms existed for a reason. To violate it is to invite catastrophic consequences. Yet the Peri in love often cannot help herself. She is compelled by emotion that transcends reason and cosmic propriety. Consider the perspective of the human who finds himself beloved by a Peri. At first, such attention seems like the greatest blessing imaginable. A supernatural being of incomparable beauty loves him, desires his company, showers him with gifts and protection. She appears to him in dreams and in waking visions, her voice carrying tones of otherworldly music. She guides his actions, protects him from harm, and seems to see in him a worth and significance he scarcely recognizes in himself. Yet gradually, the human begins to comprehend the tragedy of his situation. The Peri ages not at all, while he moves inexorably toward death and decay. The love she offers, however intense and genuine, carries within it the seeds of inevitable loss. He will age, and she will remain eternal. He will die, and she will continue through the ages, carrying the memory of their love as a permanent wound in her immortal heart. Some versions of these tales suggest that the human experiences profound guilt upon realizing that his beloved Peri has endangered her own redemptive journey through love for him. He becomes tormented by the knowledge that his existence is diminishing her chances of ever returning to paradise. The classical narratives of peri-human love often unfold along predictable tragic trajectories. A mortal man, often a king or a hero of some kind, encounters a peri in circumstances that seem almost fated. Perhaps he saves her from danger, or perhaps he simply sees her at a vulnerable moment when her supernatural glamour has slipped, and he perceives her as she truly is: lonely, yearning, exiled. What begins as gratitude or pity transforms into love. The peri, finding in this mortal a genuine connection to a being who understands her suffering, falls completely and desperately in love with him. For a time, they exist in a state of bliss that seems almost to transcend the normal categories of happiness and sorrow. She teaches him knowledge no mortal should possess. He offers her a tenderness and companionship that speaks to her deepest loneliness. Yet this period of joy cannot endure. The cosmic forces that maintain the boundaries between worlds cannot tolerate such a violation indefinitely. The divine punishment for peri-human love is rendered in various forms depending on the particular narrative tradition and the theological context in which the story is told. Sometimes the peri is forced to choose between her beloved and all possibility of redemption. Remaining with him means abandoning forever any hope of returning to paradise, resigning herself to an existence neither fully mortal nor fully divine. Sometimes the human is struck down suddenly by death, called to account by forces that find his union with a peri offensive to cosmic order. Sometimes the lovers are separated, drawn to opposite ends of the earth or into different dimensions of reality, where they can sense each other's presence but never bridge the distance between them. In some heartbreaking versions, both lovers are transformed into something neither wholly themselves nor wholly other, becoming wandering spirits condemned to search eternally for reunion that can never be achieved. Yet embedded within these tragic narratives are profound truths about love, sacrifice, and the redemptive power of genuine emotion. The peri who loves a human demonstrates that her capacity for feeling has transcended her status as a celestial being. She has moved beyond the abstract pursuit of redemption into the terrifyingly concrete reality of caring desperately for another being. She has made herself vulnerable in ways that divine beings are not supposed to be vulnerable. Her love, though destructive and forbidden, represents a kind of authenticity and genuine emotional connection that speaks to the deep humanity even of these otherworldly creatures. The human, for his part, loves not merely the external beauty of his peri, beloved, but her essential being, the loneliness, the struggle, the yearning that defines her existence. His love grants her a kind of recognition and validation that no amount of righteous deed can provide. Some mystical traditions have suggested that these stories of impossible love contain hidden teachings about the nature of human spiritual longing. The love a mortal feels for a peri, they argue, mirrors the love that the human soul should feel for the divine. An overwhelming passion that transcends reason, a willingness to cross boundaries, an acceptance that such love might transform us in ways we cannot control or predict. The peri who loves a human, conversely, represents divine love reaching downward toward mortal creation, love that transcends cosmic hierarchy and categorical boundaries, love that makes oneself vulnerable, love that risks everything for connection with the beloved. Though such love may be forbidden and may carry tragic consequences, it nevertheless reveals something essential about the structure of existence itself. That connection across impossible boundaries is possible, that the barriers between realms can be crossed by passion, that love itself possesses a transgressive power that defies even cosmic law. There exists within the vast constellation of peri legends one narrative that stands particularly luminous and heartbreaking, a story that encapsulates all the essential tragic elements of Peri existence. This is the tale of Layla al-Peri, though she had many names across different tellings and different lands, and her encounter with a mortal named Amin, a merchant prince whose beauty and kindness became the catalyst for a love that would alter both their eternal destinies. The story begins not with the meeting of these two souls, but with Layla's transgression in paradise itself, the minor violation that resulted in her exile and set her upon the path toward redemption. She had questioned divine judgment in a moment of compassion. She had witnessed an immortal being punished, and her heart rebelled against what seemed to her an unjust severity. In that single moment of doubt and compassion, she had spoken words she should not have spoken, and the consequences rippled outward through eternity. Layla's exile began as all Peri exiles begin, with a terrible acceleration through darkening realms, a sensation of being torn away from divine presence, of light diminishing, and the suffocating weight of separation descending upon her. She fell through layers of reality, through planes of existence that grew progressively more material and less refined, until finally she found herself upon the earthly plane, stripped of her direct connection to the divine, unable to return to the gardens she had known. The beauty that had been enhanced and elevated by proximity to the divine remained, but it now carried within it a quality of sadness that no amount of ethereal radiance could conceal. For centuries, she wandered the mortal world, performing acts of redemptive righteousness, protecting travelers, guiding lost souls, defending the innocent from malevolent Djinn. She seemed content enough with this lonely pilgrimage of atonement, believing that eventually, through sufficient righteous deeds, she might be permitted to return. Then came the night when Layla encountered Amin. He was traveling through a desolate desert region, part of a trading caravan that had become separated from its guides through the manipulation of malevolent Djinn, who sought to enslave the merchants and claim their cargo. Layla observed from the shadows as these dark forces circled the terrified humans, and without thought of the consequences, she intervened. She manifested herself in a form visible to mortal eyes, her luminescence cutting through the darkness like a beacon, and she drove back the malevolent Djinn with displays of power that left Amin and his companions breathless with wonder and terror. When the danger had passed and the Djinn had retreated to their own dimensions, Amin looked upon his rescuer and experienced a moment that would define the remainder of his mortal existence. He saw not merely a beautiful supernatural being, he saw something that transcended all categories of beauty and entered into the realm of the holy. He fell to his knees, uncertain whether to pray or to declare his love. Layla, for her part, experienced something equally transformative. She had grown accustomed to the gratitude of mortals, to their thanks and their admiration. But as she gazed into Amin's eyes, she perceived something she had not encountered before, a recognition of her suffering, a compassion for her exile, a profound sadness that seemed to mirror her own. In that moment of mutual recognition, the boundaries that had protected her redemptive journey dissolved. She understood with terrible clarity that she was about to commit an act that would doom her return to paradise. And yet she found that she could not prevent herself from descending that path. She remained with Amin through that night and the days that followed, abandoning the careful work of redemptive righteousness to pursue something that transcended righteousness itself. For a brief and radiant time, Layla and Amin existed together in a state that seemed to transcend the normal laws of reality. Amin brought her to his palace in a great city, where he presented her to his court as a being of supernatural origin, a Peri chosen by fate to be his Brahmanantai. The courtiers and the people marveled at her beauty and accepted her presence as something wondrous. Amin lavished upon her the wealth of kingdoms, adorned her with jewels and fine garments, and seemed to exist solely to bring her happiness and fulfillment. Layla, for the first time since her exile, experienced something approaching contentment. Yet beneath this apparent happiness ran an undercurrent of profound anxiety. She felt the cosmic forces that maintained the boundaries between realms growing increasingly disturbed by her violation of ancient law. She sensed the attention of the divine turning toward her with something that resembled both anger and sorrow. Almost imperceptibly, Amin began to age. Layla watched with increasing horror as the man she loved became marked by time in ways she had not anticipated. Grey appeared in his hair, lines formed upon his face. His movements became slower and more labored. She realized with devastating clarity that he would not endure eternally as she did. He would grow old, and eventually he would die, and she would remain. The weight of this knowledge transformed her love into a kind of desperate anguish. She began to research the most forbidden of magical arts, seeking through her connections to the Djinn world knowledge of how to make Amin immortal, how to preserve him from the ravages of time. Some accounts suggest she sought to transform him into a Peri himself, believing that if he were no longer mortal, the cosmic law preventing their union might somehow be circumvented. But before Layla could accomplish any such transformation, the divine judgment she had been dreading finally arrived. The celestial beings who maintained cosmic order could no longer tolerate her violation. Some accounts describe a great voice speaking from the heavens, pronouncing her fate. Others describe the sudden appearance of angelic beings who confronted her with her transgression and demanded her submission to judgment. In all versions, the outcome is the same. Layla was given an impossible choice. She could renounce her love for Amin and return to her redemptive path, abandoning him and any hope of continuing their life together. But in doing so, she might eventually be permitted to return to paradise. Or she could remain with Amin. But in choosing him, she must accept that she would never return to the divine realms from which she had fallen. She would become increasingly tied to the mortal world, her immortality becoming less a blessing than a curse as she watched her beloved age and eventually pass beyond the veil of death. Layla chose to remain with Amin. In that choice, she forever renounced her redemptive journey toward paradise and accepted, instead, a different kind of eternity, one bound to earthly existence and to love itself as her only guiding principle. Some versions of the story suggest that when Amin finally died, after many years of life together, Layla was permitted to follow him into whatever realm awaited souls after death, that her great love was itself recognized as a form of redemption that transcended cosmic law. Others suggest she remains still, a wandering spirit eternally searching for her beloved in the depths of time, unable to move forward but unable to relinquish hope. At the heart of Peri mythology lies a question that has preoccupied theologians and poets for centuries. What does redemption mean for beings already existing outside normal time and morality? For those Peri who have not surrendered themselves entirely to forbidden love, who have not abandoned the redemptive path for transgression, there remains an endless spiritual journey toward restoration and divine grace. This is a redemption fundamentally different from human redemption. Humans live finite lives in which repentance and reform must be compressed into years or decades. Peri have millennia to work toward their return to paradise, to gradually prove their worthiness through accumulated righteous acts. Yet this vast expanse of available time brings its own form of torment. The Peri cannot know if their efforts will ever prove sufficient, cannot know if the debt incurred by their original transgression will ever be fully discharged. They exist in perpetual uncertainty, forever striving toward a goal that may ultimately remain forever beyond reach. The conditions for Peri redemption are never clearly defined in any single authoritative text. And this ambiguity is itself significant. Different theological traditions suggest different pathways and different endpoints. Some propose that the Peri must perform a specific number of righteous deeds of sufficient magnitude to balance their transgression, a cosmic calculus in which virtue and wrongdoing are weighed against each other on cosmic scales. Others suggest that redemption is not a matter of quantifiable achievement, but rather of transformation. The Peri must become genuinely different beings, must purify themselves of the impulses and weaknesses that led to their original fall. Still others propose that redemption cannot be achieved through action alone, but requires recognition and forgiveness from the divine, a restoration of grace that depends ultimately on divine will rather than Peri effort. This theological uncertainty produces a particular form of spiritual agony. The Peri cannot know precisely what is required of them. They can only continue their work, hoping that at some point their effort will be recognized and rewarded. Many Peri choose to dedicate themselves to the protection of righteous humans and the defense against malevolent Djinn. This choice reflects a profound spiritual logic. By protecting and serving those who remain within divine favor, by defending the righteous against evil, the Peri place themselves symbolically on the side of goodness and order. Each act of protection is simultaneously an act of service to humanity and an act of self-purification, a demonstration of commitment to the divine order, despite their exile from it. The Peri, who serve as guardians, are essentially arguing through their actions that they deserve restoration, that they have proven themselves capable of consistent righteousness, that they have transcended the weakness that led to their fall. Some Peri develop deep relationships with particular human families or communities, watching over them across generations, intervening only when the survival of the righteous is genuinely threatened. Other Peri pursue redemption through mystical and spiritual disciplines. They undertake practices of asceticism and meditation, seeking to purify themselves through denial and contemplative discipline. Some withdraw from the world entirely, dwelling in remote locations where they engage in worship and remembrance of the divine from which they are separated. They recite sacred prayers and verses, maintaining connection to the divine will even from their position of exile. These Peri seem almost to suggest that redemption is not primarily about external action, but about internal transformation, about achieving a state of consciousness in which the separation from paradise is understood and accepted, in which longing is transmuted into spiritual devotion. They maintain faith that the divine, witnessing their sustained commitment to righteousness despite their exile, will eventually respond with mercy and restoration. The process of Peri redemption often involves cycles of approach and recession, moments when redemption seems almost attainable, and moments when the Peri despairs that return to paradise is impossible. Some accounts describe seasons of the year when the barriers between realms grow thin, when paradise seems almost perceptible to exiled Peri, as though they stand at the very threshold of return. During these liminal times, the Peri's yearning becomes almost unbearable. They sense the proximity of what they have lost and experience renewed determination to prove themselves worthy of restoration. Yet when these seasons pass and the veil between worlds becomes opaque once more, despair can threaten to overwhelm the Peri's commitment. The cycle of hope and despair becomes itself a form of trial, a test of whether their dedication to redemption is genuine or merely conditioned by circumstance. One significant aspect of Peri redemption theology concerns the role of divine mercy in the process. However much the Peri labor to purify themselves through righteous action, redemption ultimately depends upon divine grace, upon a recognition from the divine that these beings have suffered sufficiently and grown sufficiently that restoration is warranted. This introduces an element of humility into the Peri's redemptive journey. They cannot simply earn their return through accumulated good deeds. They must also accept their dependence upon divine mercy, must surrender their will, ultimately, to divine judgment. This surrender of control is particularly difficult for beings who possess vast power and knowledge. The Peri must acknowledge that all their efforts might ultimately prove insufficient unless accompanied by divine forgiveness. They must accept that redemption is not a right they can claim through effort, but a gift they can only receive through grace. Some mystical traditions suggest that the Peri seeking redemption enter into a form of symbiotic relationship with righteous humans who can serve as intermediaries with the divine, a human saint or spiritual master, recognizing the Peri's sincere commitment to redemption, might offer prayers and supplications on the Peri's behalf, essentially lending their spiritual authority and proximity to the divine to assist the Peri in their redemptive journey. Such relationships are portrayed as deeply moving, the human taking on the burden of praying for the redemption of an exiled being, the Peri experiencing profound gratitude for this intercession. This dynamic suggests that redemption is not purely an individual achievement, but a communal process involving both the seeking being and those who support them. The question of whether any Peri have actually achieved redemption and returned to paradise remains unanswered throughout the mythological tradition. Some stories suggest that certain Peri have indeed returned, having finally discharged the debt incurred by their transgression and proven themselves worthy of restoration. These Peri are celebrated as examples of what persistent righteousness can achieve, proof that even exile from paradise is not necessarily eternal. Other traditions suggest that redemption remains perpetually future, always approaching, but never quite achieved. That the Peri are locked in an eternal journey of approach toward divine grace that will continue indefinitely. This uncertainty is itself spiritually profound, suggesting that the value of the Peri's righteous efforts lies not in their eventual reward, but in the commitment itself, in the willingness to pursue righteousness and service, despite the possibility that paradise may never be restored. The Peri have never existed solely within the realm of narrative and theology. They have manifested themselves equally vividly in the visual and mystical traditions of Islamic and Persian civilization, becoming central figures in artistic expression and spiritual practice. In the grand miniature paintings that decorated royal manuscripts in the courts of the Safavid and Mughal dynasties, the Peri emerged as recurring figures of aesthetic and spiritual significance. These miniatures, created with meticulous detail and luminous pigments that seemed to contain light within themselves, presented the Peri not as distant mythological figures, but as beings intimately present to the consciousness of the viewer. To look at a Persian miniature depicting a Peri was not merely to observe an image, it was to experience a kind of spiritual communion with celestial beauty. The artists who created these images understood themselves as channeling divine inspiration, translating the ineffable beauty of the Peri into visual form through techniques and materials that themselves seem to border on the sacred. In these magnificent miniatures, the Peri are invariably surrounded by the most beautiful elements of creation. They stand in gardens of impossible perfection, where flowers bloom in colors that transcend natural possibility, where water fountains display an otherworldly clarity, and seem to sing within harmonies. The Peri themselves are rendered with hair flowing like liquid night or silver, adorned with jewelry that catches light in ways that suggest supernatural origin. Their garments are rendered in extraordinary detail, silks of deep blues and emerald greens, embroidered with geometric patterns and celestial imagery. butterflies and birds surround the Peri in these paintings, as though nature itself recognizes their presence and congregates around them. The compositions of these miniatures employ principles of spiritual geometry. The Peri is frequently positioned at the center of concentric circles of beauty, as though they are the organizing principle around which the cosmos arranges itself. Every element in the miniature serves to reinforce the Peri's status as beings of transcendent beauty and cosmic significance. The act of creating such miniatures was itself understood by some artists and patrons as a form of spiritual practice. To paint a Peri with genuine reverence and skill was to participate in a kind of visual prayer, an attempt to render visible the invisible realms and the beings that inhabited them. The materials used in creating these miniatures were themselves precious and semi-sacred. Lapis lazuli, imported from Afghanistan at enormous expense, was ground into powder to create the deep blues that characterize Peri garments and celestial backgrounds. Gold leaf was applied to highlights and details, suggesting the association between the Peri and divine light. The use of such expensive and precious materials implied that the work of depicting the Peri was considered sacred work, worthy of the finest resources available to the artist. Some accounts suggest that artists working on Peri miniatures would undertake ritual purifications before beginning their work, approaching the task as though preparing for prayer. Beyond the art of miniature painting, the Peri figured prominently in the broader decorative traditions of Islamic civilization. They appear in illuminated manuscripts, in tile work decorating mosque interiors and palace walls, in carpet designs of extraordinary complexity and beauty. In the great mosques and shrines of Iran and Central Asia, visitors encountering tiles decorated with images of Peri would be reminded that the visible world participated in and reflected the invisible realms inhabited by these celestial beings. The Peri, in decorative contexts, served almost an apotropaic function. Their presence in sacred spaces suggested divine protection, the participation of celestial forces in sanctifying and blessing the spaces where they were depicted. The gardens represented in tile work and carpet designs were understood as echoes or reflections of the gardens of paradise, where the Peri dwelled or once dwelled, bringing into earthly spaces something of the beauty and spiritual significance of the heavenly realms. In the mystical traditions of Sufism, the Peri acquired additional layers of symbolic significance that transcended mere aesthetic appreciation. For the Sufi poets and mystics who dominated Islamic spiritual life from the 12th century onward, the Peri became a symbol of the soul itself, exiled from divine presence through its embodiment in material form, yearning desperately for reunion with the divine source. The Peri's exile mirrored the human soul's separation from God. The Peri's redemptive journey paralleled the mystical path that the Sufi traveler undertook, seeking to return to union with the divine. In Sufi poetry, the beloved Peri frequently represents the divine beauty that draws the soul toward transcendence, that calls the spiritual seeker forward despite all obstacles. The love between a Peri and a human in this mystical context becomes a metaphor for the love between the soul and God, impossible in conventional terms, yet the most genuine and most powerful force in the universe. Sufi mystics like Jalaluddin Rumi and Hafez employed Peri imagery extensively in their poetry and spiritual teachings. In their works, the Peri embodies spiritual aspiration and the intoxication of divine love. She represents beauty that points beyond itself toward the infinite, that can be contemplated as a stepping stone toward deeper mystical experience. The fragrance associated with the Peri in these mystical contexts becomes something like the fragrance of divine presence, something detected by those with refined spiritual senses, an indication that one is approaching proximity to the divine. The Peri's wings, in mystical interpretation, suggest both the transcendence the soul seeks and the medium through which the soul travels toward reunion with God. To contemplate the Peri in this mystical framework is to engage in a form of meditation that can gradually purify the heart and prepare it for union with the divine. The concept of the Peri entered into practical Sufi ritual and spiritual discipline as well. Some Sufi orders incorporated contemplation of the Peri into their initiation practices and spiritual training. Initiates might be asked to meditate upon the image of a Peri as a means of cultivating certain spiritual states. The meditation upon the Peri's exile and redemptive journey could elicit compassion and understanding of the human spiritual condition. The contemplation of the Peri's beauty could elevate the consciousness toward higher realms and more subtle dimensions of reality. Some mystical texts suggest that through sustained contemplation of the Peri, one might eventually achieve glimpses of the Peri in visionary states, not as external images, but as inner experiences of celestial beauty and presence. These encounters, whether interpreted as genuinely seeing supernatural beings or as profound experiences of expanded consciousness, were understood as gifts from the divine, affirmations that the mystical path was genuine and that union with the divine was possible. The symbolic association between the Peri and spiritual transformation became so deeply embedded in Islamic mysticism that references to the Peri appear throughout Sufi literature not merely as literal beings, but as symbols freighted with complex spiritual meaning. To speak of a Peri in mystical poetry might be to speak of the soul, of spiritual beauty, of the goal of mystical practice, of divine love itself. The Peri becomes almost a technical term within mystical discourse, a way of referring to realities that transcend conventional language. The fragrance and beauty traditionally associated with the Peri are transformed into symbolic representations of divine attributes. The fragrance becomes the scent of sanctity. The beauty becomes the radiance of divine glory, visible through created forms. We inhabit a world profoundly different from the medieval courts where Persian miniaturists labored over their Peri paintings. Yet the presence of these exiled beings remains vivid and active in our contemporary consciousness. The Peri have not retreated into dusty historical records or faded into the realm of forgotten mythology. They have instead transformed, adapted, and persisted through successive waves of cultural change. In modern literature, in cinema and visual arts, in the spiritual practices of contemporary seekers, the Peri continue to exercise their ancient power of attraction and fascination. The very fact that these beings endure in our modern imagination, centuries after the historical contexts that originally produced their mythology, suggests something profound about their archetypal nature. They speak to desires and longings that transcend particular historical moments, addressing themselves to the eternal human, yearning for transcendence, beauty, and redemption. In modern Arabic and Persian literature, the Peri have remained central figures, though often reconceived for contemporary contexts. 20th and 21st century writers have drawn upon Peri mythology to explore questions of displacement, exile, and the search for belonging that characterize modern experience. The Peri's exile from paradise becomes a metaphor for the experience of displacement and diaspora that defines so much of contemporary literature. Writers like Naguib Mahfouz and other modern literary figures have incorporated Peri imagery into narratives grappling with the tension between traditional Islamic spirituality and contemporary secular reality. In their works, the Peri often embodies the yearning for connection to ancestral traditions and spiritual depths that modernity threatens to obliterate. The Peri's quest for redemption parallels the quest of modern individuals seeking to recover meaning and spiritual authenticity in worlds increasingly dominated by material concerns and technological mediation. These reimaginings preserve the essential tragic dignity of the Peri, while situating them within recognizably modern dilemmas. Western fantasy literature has also embraced Peri mythology, though often with significant transformations and adaptations. Fantasy authors writing outside Islamic and Persian traditions have encountered the Peri through Orientalist sources and have incorporated them into fictional worlds alongside other mythological beings. In some cases, Peri are portrayed as a specific category of fairy or magical being with particular characteristics and powers. While these Western adaptations sometimes lack the theological sophistication of traditional Islamic and Persian treatments of the Peri, they nevertheless demonstrate the enduring power of Peri mythology to capture imaginations across cultural boundaries. The Peri's essential characteristics, their ethereal beauty, their capacity for love and sacrifice, their exile from divine favor, their redemptive yearning, prove to be archetypal enough to resonate even in contexts far removed from their original cultural matrices. These fantasy reimaginings may lack theological precision, but they preserve something essential about what makes the Peri narratively and emotionally compelling. In contemporary Islamic, intellectual and spiritual circles, the Peri remain figures of serious contemplation. Islamic scholars and mystics continue to draw upon Peri mythology as a resource for thinking about profound questions regarding divine mercy, spiritual transformation, and the nature of exile and redemption. Modern Sufi practitioners incorporate Peri symbolism into their spiritual practices and poetry, much as their medieval predecessors did. The Peri continues to appear in contemporary Sufi poetry and mystical writings as a symbol of the soul seeking reunion with the divine, of beauty that points toward transcendence, of love that transcends conventional limitations. The endurance of Peri's symbolism within living Islamic spiritual traditions, not merely as historical artifact, but as active resource for contemplation and practice, suggests that these beings address themselves to perennial dimensions of human spiritual experience. Contemporary Muslims encountering Peri mythology often experience profound recognition, as though these ancient figures speak directly to their own spiritual struggles and aspirations. The influence of Peri mythology extends into contemporary film and visual media as well. Iranian cinema in particular has drawn extensively upon Peri imagery and narrative themes, exploring how these ancient mythological figures might illuminate contemporary experiences and struggles. Films that reference or incorporate Peri themes often use the mythology to interrogate questions of belonging, identity, and the possibility of transformation. The Peri's exile and yearning resonate with experiences of displacement and spiritual searching that characterize contemporary experience across the Islamic world and beyond. Visual artists working in painting, sculpture, and installation art have similarly drawn upon Peri imagery to create works that bridge traditional and contemporary aesthetics. These artworks often employ the Peri as a vehicle for exploring themes of beauty, transcendence, and the sacred in ways that contemporary media and materials allow. The translation of Peri mythology into contemporary artistic forms demonstrates the flexibility and resilience of these figures. They are not locked into historical contexts, but remain capable of speaking to new generations through new media. In academic and scholarly contexts, Peri mythology has become a subject of serious study and interpretation. Scholars of Islamic literature, folklore, art history, and comparative mythology have produced substantial bodies of work examining how Peri figures function within their original contexts and how they have transformed through history. The study of Peri mythology has contributed to broader scholarly conversations about the relationship between Islamic theology and pre-Islamic traditions, about the role of feminine figures in mythological systems, and about how cultures process and transform inherited narratives across historical change. Academic attention to the Peri has itself contributed to their continued presence in contemporary consciousness, making sophisticated engagement with Peri mythology accessible to educated audiences who might not otherwise encounter these traditions. The development of academic discourse around the Peri has transformed them from purely folk or religious material into subjects worthy of intellectual scrutiny and aesthetic appreciation. New Age spirituality and contemporary mysticism have also incorporated Peri mythology into their frameworks. Some contemporary spiritual practitioners who draw upon diverse religious traditions have identified the Peri with broader categories of celestial beings or divine helpers. While these interpretations sometimes lack historical grounding and may misrepresent traditional understandings of the Peri, they nevertheless demonstrate the continued resonance of Peri imagery in spiritual-seeking contexts. The Peri's association with beauty, transcendence, and spiritual aspiration makes them attractive to contemporary practitioners searching for connections to non-Western spiritual traditions. The possibility of encountering Peri through meditation or spiritual practice, though not grounded in traditional Islamic or Persian frameworks, reflects the continued vitality of Peri mythology as a living spiritual resource. These contemporary appropriations, while sometimes controversial among traditional scholars, nevertheless testify to the power of Peri mythology to address itself across cultural and temporal boundaries to the spiritual yearnings of diverse populations. Perhaps most significantly, the Peri have established themselves within the realm of popular imagination and collective cultural memory across the Muslim world, and increasingly beyond it. Stories of the Peri are told and retold, adapted and reimagined, passed from generation to generation. Children grow up hearing tales of these beautiful exiled beings, and these stories shape their imaginations and their understanding of what is possible in the universe. The Peri have become part of the cultural vocabulary through which people understand beauty, exile, love, and redemption. When someone describes an experience as transcendent, as otherworldly, as filled with bittersweet beauty, they are often drawing upon imagery and sensibilities deeply influenced by Peri mythology, even if they do not consciously recognize the source. The mythology has become so thoroughly woven into the cultural fabric of Islamic and Persian civilization that its influence is often invisible, taken for granted as part of the natural landscape of aesthetic and spiritual possibility. We have journeyed together through centuries of mythology and spirituality, tracing the arc of the Peri from demonic being to redeemable soul, from cosmic outcast to symbol of transcendent aspiration. We have witnessed their transformation across different theological frameworks, observed their manifestation in art and literature, contemplated their terrible beauty and their profound longing. Now, as we stand at the threshold between our exploration and the world beyond this narrative, we must ask the deepest question. What do the Peri truly represent? What timeless human truths are encoded within these figures of exile and redemption? And why have they endured across centuries and cultures? The answer lies not in any single element of their mythology, but in the totality of their being, in the complete picture of what it means to be a creature caught between light and shadow, forever yearning, yet never entirely hopeless. The Peri embody a fundamental paradox of human existence that transcends cultural and historical boundaries. They represent the capacity to fall from grace while retaining the possibility of redemption. They symbolize the human experience of exile, not necessarily from geographic places, but from states of wholeness and peace that we once knew or imagined we once knew. Every human being, in their own way, experiences something analogous to the Peri's separation from paradise. We are born into innocence, gradually become aware of the world's complexity and our own capacity for transgression, and then spend much of our lives seeking to restore ourselves to states of grace or peace or authenticity that seem increasingly distant. The Peri's journey mirrors this arc so precisely that encountering them often produces a shock of recognition. We see ourselves reflected in these exiled beings, and in their struggles, we perceive our own spiritual situation reflected with startling clarity. The beauty of the Peri cannot be separated from their sorrow, and this inseparable conjunction reveals a profound truth about existence itself. The Peri are beautiful precisely because they are exiled, precisely because they yearn, precisely because they suffer with dignity and refuse to surrender to despair. Their ethereal radiance carries within it the radiance of beings who have endured and persevered through trial. This teaches us that authentic beauty is never merely pleasant or superficial. It is always complicated, always deepened by struggle and loss. The Peri who glow with celestial light do so not because they are untouched by suffering, but because they have been touched by it and have chosen to transmute that suffering into nobility and purpose. In a world increasingly obsessed with trivial forms of beauty, the polished surfaces and airbrushed perfections of contemporary image culture, the Peri remind us that true beauty emerges from depth, from the integration of sorrow and joy, from the fullness of lived experience. The Peri's capacity for love, even when that love leads to transgression and further exile, reveals something equally profound about the human heart. We are beings capable of loving across impossible boundaries, of choosing connection and passion even when reason counsels restraint. The Peri who fall in love with humans are not depicted as weak or foolish. They are depicted as courageous beings willing to risk everything for genuine connection. This challenges us to recognize that the greatest human dramas emerge not from perfect adherence to law or duty, but from the collision between law and love, between cosmic order and the yearnings of the heart. The Peri teach us that sometimes the most morally significant choices involve transgression, not for its own sake, but because genuine values sometimes conflict, and we must choose which to honor. The Peri who choose love over redemption are not wrong. They are human in the deepest sense, asserting the primacy of connection and authenticity over abstract categories of justice or order. Perhaps most importantly, the Peri embody the possibility of redemption and restoration. In a universe where many traditions suggest that some beings are eternally damned and beyond all hope of recovery, the Peri represent the Islamic and Persian insistence that mercy transcends all boundaries. The Peri cannot achieve redemption alone. It requires sustained effort, yes, but also the possibility of divine grace, the recognition that even the most serious transgression need not be permanent, that even exile is potentially temporary. This offers profound comfort to anyone grappling with guilt or failure, anyone who has separated themselves from grace through their own actions and wonders if restoration is possible. The Peri's eternal journey toward redemption, whether or not it ultimately succeeds, demonstrates that the effort itself has meaning and dignity. We are not merely what we have done, we are also what we are becoming. And the trajectory of our becoming matters more than the individual failures that punctuate our existence. The mythology of the Peri also reveals something crucial about how cultures remember and transform their spiritual traditions. The Peri begin as demons in Zoroastrian cosmology and gradually become symbols of redemptive aspiration in Islamic theology. This transformation is not a rejection of the earlier understanding, but an evolution of it, a recognition that beings can change, that understanding can deepen, that what appeared to be purely evil might contain within it possibilities for good. The history of Peri mythology is the history of a culture learning to integrate different spiritual frameworks, to allow traditions to speak to each other across time, to recognize that revelation and insight can occur in multiple forms and contexts. The Peri teach us that we need not discard our past understandings. We can instead transform them, finding new meaning within old forms, allowing our ancestors' images to speak to new situations and new spiritual longings. As we conclude our journey through Peri mythology, we recognize that these beings are not mere artifacts of ancient belief systems or interesting historical curiosities. They are living forces in the contemporary imagination, continuing to speak to us across the centuries about transcendence and love, about exile and redemption, about the possibility of transformation and the dignity of struggle. If this exploration of the Peri has resonated with you, if you have found in their story something that illuminates your own spiritual journey, we invite you to deepen your engagement with echoes of the old world. Subscribe to our channel to continue exploring the mythologies, legends, and spiritual traditions that have shaped human consciousness across the ages. These ancient voices have much to teach us about who we are and who we might become. The Peri stand eternally at the threshold between worlds, beautiful and sorrowful, yearning and dignified. In their exile, they teach us about our own separation from wholeness. In their redemptive efforts, they show us that recovery and restoration are always possible. In their capacity for love, they remind us that the heart's logic often transcends the mind's categories. The Peri are not merely beings from ancient mythology. They are mirrors in which we perceive ourselves, guides pointing us toward truths we need most urgently to remember.